And then there are two symptoms that don't fit into any of these categories. One is lack of insight. That means the patient who's psychotic doesn't know they're psychotic. They don't know that the voices they hear aren't real. They don't know that they sound crazy when they try to describe something, that they have severe thought disorder. Now, there are other disorders with lack of insight. In the early stages of dementia, like Alzheimer's, the person is aware that they're having trouble remembering. But in the latter stages, they have no idea that the person that they don't recognize in front of them is someone that they have known for their entire life, perhaps their own spouse or their own child. The other is functional disability. If you talk about all of the symptoms that we are describing and realize that they tend to come and go, but they tend not to go away completely, and that they're there all the time at one level or another, you can imagine the person wouldn't be very impressive in a job interview. They wouldn't be able to work with the public. They probably wouldn't be able to hold a job. And so they're not able to fulfill the roles that people are expected to fill as adults. That's called functional disability. We've been talking about the symptoms of schizophrenia. Many of these symptoms also occur in other psychotic disorders. We're going to go through several disorders in turn, including the disorders shown on this slide. Schizophreniform disorder, as the name suggests, looks like schizophrenia. But unlike schizophrenia, which tends to be very chronic, typically the symptoms here last only a few months, and often the age of onset is much later. So most people develop schizophrenia before the age of 30. But schizophreniform disorder can develop at almost any age and usually goes away at some point. These individuals prior to the onset of the symptoms usually are fairly healthy. We call that a good premorbid history or good premorbid before the disorder functioning. And often they return to normal lives afterwards. This is relatively uncommon. About 1 in 500 people will experience schizophreniform disorder at some time during their life. Schizoaffective disorder appears to be schizophrenia with a mood disorder, usually depression. And in fact, there's pretty good evidence at this point that it really is two disorders. Now, depression tends to come and go. It's a cyclical disorder, and the same is true in schizoaffective disorder. The depression as a symptom tends to come and go, but the schizophrenic symptoms tend to be fairly stable and exist for decades sometimes. They appear to be completely independent, though. And in fact, the difference in behavior between people with schizoaffective and schizophrenia disorder and schizophrenia seem to be dictated mostly by the schizophrenia. They tend to be very similar in that respect. Brief psychotic disorders sometimes are indistinguishable from schizophrenic disorders. They tend to emphasize positive symptoms. They tend to come on quickly. They can occur at any time of life, so it's not an early onset as we find in schizophrenia. And they rarely last more than 2 or 3 weeks, a month at the outset. Typically, they don't come out of the blue. They're usually the result, or seem to be the result, of an extreme stressor or trauma. And typically these symptoms will go away and the person will go back to their normal functioning. Now, what's interesting about brief psychotic disorders is that is what tends to hospitalize a lot of people who have the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder. Now, you may remember that borderline personality disorder and schizotypal personality disorder came from one group that we called by various names, but one of them was pseudoneurotic schizophrenia, or another name was borderline schizophrenia. But one individual, Paul Meehl, thought that, well, these people appear to be at risk for schizophrenia, and so he emphasized that. And another individual out of Kernberg thought that, well, most of these people never develop a psychotic disorder, so he emphasized that. And hence we came up with two very different but heavily overlapping personality disorders. What's interesting is people with the diagnosis of borderline personality disorder will develop brief psychotic disorders, but they're not schizophrenia that they develop. Now, a small number do, but mostly it's this brief psychotic disorder. They're hospitalized for a week or two, and then they go back to their normal life. The next psychotic disorder is delusional disorder, and as the name implies, delusions are the primary symptoms. In fact, in most cases, they're almost exclusively the only symptoms. The typical positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia are not present. There are several types of delusional disorders depending upon the nature of the delusional content. This is a fairly rare disorder, and typical onset is middle-aged into old age. There are some other psychotic disorders which I'm going to mention only briefly. Shared psychotic disorder is a disorder in which two people share the same delusional content. The normal situation is that one of those people is dominant and the other is very submissive. And essentially the delusional material is coming from the dominant individual. And the very submissive individual essentially goes along with whatever that person says. The DSM has added, in the most recent edition, 2 additional disorders. Now, these have been around for a while, but recognizing that they are psychotic conditions is an important step. We have known for a long time that substances can create psychotic conditions. If you have an amphetamine overdose, for example, you may very well have a psychosis that on the surface looks exactly like schizophrenia, although once the amphetamines leave your system, the psychotic symptoms will go away. Also, psychotic symptoms may be the result of other physical disorders, and therefore need to be treated by treating that physical disorder. Psychotic disorders like schizophrenia are so dramatic that they scream out for us to want to know what causes them. What's clear on the basis of decades of research is there is no one single cause for any psychotic disorder, including schizophrenia. There seem to be many factors involved, so we will talk a bit about all of those. Let's talk initially about genes and family environment. If we do a family study of schizophrenia, we start with individuals who have the disorder, and we call them the proband. We'll have many people with schizophrenia, and then we will identify their relatives and determine the relationship that they have. Are they parents? Are they siblings? Are they half-sibs? Aunts, uncles, etc., and determine whether or not they have schizophrenia. Now, the relationship within the family determines how many genes are shared. You share 50% of your genes on average with your parents and with your siblings and with your children, and 25% of your genes with your grandparents, your aunts and uncles, and with your nieces and nephews. So in a family study, the closer your genetic relationship, if genes contribute to a disorder like schizophrenia, the more likely those individuals will also show schizophrenia. But the problem with family studies is the degree of genetic relationship is often confounded with, that is, occurs at the same time, with how much physical contact you have. So, for example, you tend to live with your first-degree relatives, your parents, your siblings. You tend not to live with your aunts and uncles, and might have even less contact with people that have less of a genetic relationship to you. So genes and environment are confounded. It's hard for us to tell whether they are present. Now, a family study can show that there isn't a genetic contribution, because if there is a genetic contribution, it has to run in families. But if it does run in families, we don't know if it's the genes or if it's the environment or both. These are data gathered from dozens of studies conducted over almost 50 years, showing the degree of relationship, the amount of genes, and the risk of family members with those degree of risk. Identical twins who share 100% of their gene, if you have schizophrenia, their likelihood of schizophrenia is 48%. But half-sibs, who only share 25% of your genes, if you have schizophrenia, their risk is 6%. That's compared to the base rate of 1%. That would be the rate of people selected randomly from the population. There is a way of separating out the genes and environment. Actually, there are two ways. One is a twin study. In a twin study, the proband has schizophrenia and is a twin. What we do is we find their twin. We determine whether that twin is identical, which means shares 100% of the genes, or is a fraternal twin, essentially a sibling who happened to be conceived, carried in the womb at the same time, and delivered at the same time, but only shares 50% of the genes. We look to see what the concordance rate is for identical twins and for fraternal twins. So we take the probands who have an identical twin, and we see how many of the identical twins have schizophrenia. And we do the same thing for fraternal twins. Now, the logic here is that if you are conceived at the same time, if you're carried in the womb at the same time, if you're born at the same time, if you are raised together in the same family, you will have shared the same environment. So environment is controlled. But identical twins share 100% of their genes, and fraternal twins share 50% of their genes. So we allow the degree of genetic relationship to differ. Now, one thing that may not have been obvious, boys and girls tend to be treated differently by parents and by other people. So if you are an identical twin, you will obviously be the same sex as your identical twin. But if you're a fraternal twin, half the time, your twin is going to be the same sex, and half the time, your twin is going to be the opposite sex. Because opposite sex children are treated differently, we only use same-sex fraternal twins. The concordance rates came from the previous table that I showed you. Identical twins have a 48% concordance rate. In other words, if you start with a proband who has schizophrenia and has an identical twin, about half of their identical twins will have schizophrenia. Only about 17% of their fraternal twins will have schizophrenia, suggesting that genes play a very significant role. Now you may wonder about these pictures. Those are the Janine quadruplets. They are identical twins. They all share the same genes. They all develop schizophrenia. They all develop schizophrenia in a 9-month period. And they showed similar patterns over a long period of time. It was such an unusual case that the family was moved to Bethesda, Maryland, where the National Institute of Mental Health is, And they were studied for decades. They actually found a job and a place to live for the parents so that they could move to the DC area. And they gave us some insight, although quite frankly, the twin studies that we talked about, comparing identical and fraternal twins, has probably given us more information. The second approach for separating environment and genes is called the adoption study. Here the proband has schizophrenia and was adopted at a very young age. We insist on it being a very young age because of the possibility that perhaps the first few months of life is important enough in shaping the individual that they could increase or decrease the risk for psychosis. When you're adopted, you have two families. Your biological family shares your genetic heritage, but you never met them. You weren't raised by them. You don't know who they are generally. Your adoptive family provides your environment, but they don't share any of your genes. So we can look at the rate of schizophrenia in the biological families and the adoptive families and compare them. And what we find is that there's no increase in risk in the adoptive families, but a significant increase in risk in the biological families, which strongly suggests that genes play an important role in schizophrenia. Now that's a lot of information, but I can summarize it very briefly. The evidence is overwhelming that genes seem to play an important role in schizophrenia. But the evidence is also overwhelming that genes don't play the only role. What's the overwhelming evidence there? If genes were the sole reason why someone developed schizophrenia, and you had schizophrenia and an identical twin, your identical twin would have to have schizophrenia. But their probability of having schizophrenia is only about 50%. So environment also plays a role. This is what prompted Paul Meehl. Remember, he was the person who influenced the development of schizotypal personality disorder diagnosis, to suggest a diathesis stress model for schizophrenia. The diathesis is the genetic risk factors, whatever those are. He argued that if you had those factors, you were at risk for schizophrenia. The risk factors he called schizotaxia. You were only at risk for schizophrenia, but you invariably would develop a personality style called schizotypy. You can see where the term schizotypal personality disorder came. People with schizotypy were a little odd, but they weren't psychotic. And he argued that a small percentage of them, depending on the environment that they experienced, would go on to develop the severe symptoms of schizophrenia. Now, when we talk about genetic models, most textbooks will present the most recent data that typically are rare pedigrees, that is, families that have a large number of individuals with the disorder. And they try to do what are called linkage studies in those pedigrees. Now, I've taught this course for over 40 years, and I can tell you that it is extremely rare that those sections, typically a paragraph or two, ever appear in the next edition of the text, because they never replicate. Most schizophrenia occurs relatively infrequently in families, even though it runs in families, so there are a relatively small number of people affected. And in those rare families where there's a large number of people affected, that may very well be a different sort of disorder. And the evidence suggests that it's not a single gene, but rather several genes that work together in some way to increase risk, something we call polygenic inheritance. So what do we know? Genes play a role, and they seem to increase the risk. And there's something then in the environment that takes some of these people that are at risk and takes them the next step to develop psychosis. But what is it that is inherited? Now remember, genes are just templates for complex chemicals that we call proteins. Everything in our body is just a matter of chemical reactions. So what is it that is inherited that takes us to risk for schizophrenia, and in some individuals to schizophrenia, but 30 years after we first get the genes? Because we get our genes at conception. And most people who develop schizophrenia look pretty normal when they are children. So how do we sort that